Inshallah, it's working. You can begin now. Jazakumullah khair.
The title of this seminar for today, after welcoming all our audience from throughout the world, may Allah accept your coming here to virtually to listen to this lecture. I apologize for the delay, and thank you for bearing with me. The title of our seminar today is The Muslim Parenting Struggle, and the topic is specifically strengthening Islamic values in our children through bonding and education. Now, I wish to outline my presentation for today. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, and you can follow along with my notes. The objective today is to present. Number one is to discuss the challenge itself. What is the real challenge we are facing? And as parents, how should we view our responsibility? And thereafter, I wish to present a comprehensive plan of action for our parents on how to bring up positive and good Muslim children, practicing Muslim children, with the Islamic values and with Islamic practice, and how we can continue this legacy of Islam in our progeny and our future generations. I will be discussing different aspects. I divided up into 5 different categories. So in my view, if we as Muslim parents, if we cover all 5 of these aspects, each one of these 5 aspects is key to passing on that Islamic value and Islamic character and belief to our children, and protecting our children from the evils which are out there. So if you, in the PowerPoint presentation, I have 5 categories. Category number 1, the power of dua. And I'll discuss some of the du'as we can read. I will discuss from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam regarding the power of the parents' dua for the children. The second aspect which I will cover is understanding the responsibility itself, and the responsibility of education itself, the responsibility of educating our children. The third aspect which I will cover will be the practical education, or beyond the book knowledge, passing on Islamic values to our children. And the fourth aspect which I will cover will be the need for positive reinforcement at home, and the need for parents to practice what they preach and to show a real living example of Islam to their children. And the fifth aspect which I'll cover will be the need to bond with our children, the need to show love with our children, and the need to have that connection between parents and their children as well. So these will be the 5 aspects which I plan to cover. This seminar, I believe it's really a beginning, and it's not an end to this discussion by no means. Because this discussion is so vast, literally I believe we could spend 5 or 10 hours discussing the role of Muslim parents, and it would not be enough. So in this seminar, I simply wish to initiate the discussion and initiate this topic, and present just a few aspects for us to think about. Now, as we begin the seminar, also I wish to highlight there are numerous stories and incidents, and in fact there are numerous topics we could cover under this one topic. If we discuss all the verses of the Quran, all the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all the incidents of the people of the past, again, the seminar could easily last 5 or 10 hours, and people have written books on these subjects. So my objective today is simply to highlight a few issues, to bring a few incidents to our listeners' attention. Other than that, this is not meant to be a comprehensive discussion on the topic, and in no way can we cover this entire topic in an hour and a half or in an hour. Also, as a disclaimer, my objective is presenting the prophetic method or the sunnah method which Rasulullah has taught us with regards to our children, with regards to our responsibilities. So I will be sharing a lot of stories, many stories from the life of Rasulullah, and what I feel is the prophetic way of teaching and imparting Islamic values to our children. So as we start with the first verse of the Holy Quran, this verse is simply there to highlight to us what is our responsibility and what is the great challenge which we are facing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran, in Surah Baqarah, He highlights this great responsibility and challenge which the Muslim community faces. Sheikh Abul Hasan al-Nadwi has written, in fact he has given an entire lecture on this, which you can also see in Qurani Ifadat, or the teachings of the Quran. And Sheikh Abul Hasan al-Nadwi was a great scholar, rahimahullah, great scholar of the last century, and he used to examine the Quran and study the Quran at a very deep level and derive lessons and derive points for us to learn from. In this verse in the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this relationship between the father, Yaqub alayhi salam, who is the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and his children. And specifically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing to us this vivid description of the deathbed of the father being on the deathbed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, أَمْ كُنْتُمْ شُهَدَاءَ إِذْ حَضَرَ يَعْقُوبَ الْمَوْتُ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now paints the scene in front of us as if we can see it with our own eyes. That O listener and O Muslims, were you not present? Were you not physically present and watching the scene unfold in front of your eyes? When is the Hadar Yaqub al-Mawtu? When death came to Yaqub alayhi salam. So in this one verse of the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes to us how this father, Yaqub alayhi salam, how this great prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how he gave his parting advice to his children. In the Arabic language we call this wasiyah. In other languages as well, this term is used. For example, the Urdu language, the term wasiyah, which is your final bequest or your parting advice which the person gives at the time of death. So in these two verses of the Holy Quran, in Surah Baqarah, this is verse 132 and verse 133. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has recorded these words of Yaqub alayhi salam forever, so that parents afterwards and Muslims afterwards can learn from this advice and parting advice of Yaqub alayhi salam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَوَصَّى بِهَا إِبْرَاهِيمُ بَنِيهِ وَيَعْقُوبُ. That Ibrahim alayhi salam, who as we know is the grandfather of Yaqub alayhi salam. Right? Ibrahim alayhi salam was the grandfather. His son was Ishaq. Ishaq's son was Yaqub, and Yaqub's son was Yusuf alayhi salam. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the hadith has praised this great lineage and praised this family in different ways. Al-Karim ibn Karim ibn Karim ibn Karim. So Yaqub alayhi salam and his grandfather Ibrahim alayhi salam, they both gave wasiyah, they both gave parting advice to their children, and they both gave firm advice to their children to hold fast to the kalima, La ilaha illallah, or to hold fast to the religion of Islam. And they said to their children, Inna Allah astafa lakum ad-deen, fala tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has selected this religion for you. So make sure that you only die as Muslims. Make sure at all costs you leave this world in a state of faith, in a state of belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those who understand the Arabic language, they can share with us. Those who understand the Arabic language can appreciate the level of emphasis found here. La tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. Never die in any other way besides Islam. Never leave this world in any other state than the state of Islam. Furthermore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says, were you not witnesses when death came to Yaqub alayhi salam? When he said to his children, you can imagine now the scene, the father is on his deathbed and the children are all around him. Time is limited, the breaths are limited. The father only has a few, perhaps, moments or even seconds to speak. So Yaqub alayhi salam says to his children, what will you worship after I leave? Now in this question, it seems to be a very straightforward question. Any Muslim parent would ask their children, who do you worship And if I leave this world, who will you worship? Right? It's meant to be a very straightforward question, and on the outward, it seems to be a very straightforward question. However, sometimes it's a thought that counts. And sometimes in that question, we can understand the mindset of the father. Right? That this is a great prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is someone who spent his whole life passing on Islam to his children, teaching his children about Islam, teaching his children who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You'll note, whenever Yaqub alayhi salam speaks to his children in Surah Yusuf, you'll see numerous conversations between the father and children preserved for us in Surah Yusuf. In almost every single conversation in Surah Yusuf, Yaqub alayhi salam somehow or another ties in the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to his children and introduces his children to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي Allah. I complain about my sorrow and grief to Allah. وَمَا أُغْنِي عَنْكُم مِّنَ اللَّهِ شَيْئًا. And I cannot protect you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you'll observe this if someone reads Surah Yusuf with the observing eye and paying attention to how Yaqub alayhi salam speaks. In almost every sentence, Yaqub alayhi salam is describing the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and reminding his children of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Despite all of this, at the time of death, we know at the time of death, your greatest worry and concern, that burning desire inside of your heart, whatever is your greatest priority in life will come to the forefront. And here in this verse in the Holy Quran, we learn that Yaqub alayhi salam, his greatest worry and concern, and his greatest parting advice to his children is regarding them remaining Muslims and continuing to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after Yaqub alayhi salam leaves this world. So I'll just, much more can be said about this verse, much more can be said about the eloquence of this verse, but I will simply suffice at this point. Shaykh Abdul Hasan al-Nadwi, rahimahullah, he says under this verse that we learn from this verse, the take-home message from this verse is that at any era and any time period, the greatest responsibility and the greatest priority of the Muslim community is to pass on Islamic values and to pass on Islamic teachings to the next generation. This will be the greatest priority and the greatest responsibility which any Muslim community has. How to preserve Islam in the future generations, and how to ensure that our children, when we leave this world, our children will still be practicing Muslims, and they're not doing it for show. They're not just doing it because we're around. Unfortunately, this happens a lot of the time. When the cat is away, the mice will play. Sometimes when Muslim parents are too hard, sometimes the Muslim parents are too pushy, we do see with many Muslim youth who we interact with on a daily basis, many of them rebel, and many of them will only offer the prayers or go to the masjid when the parents aren't around. And that love and that desire and that inner will and self-motivation sometimes is not there. But nevertheless, I simply wish to establish this point that we as the Muslim community and Muslim parents specifically, we should take it on that our greatest responsibility as parents in this world is not necessarily that our children become doctors, that they get degrees, that they make a lot of money. That's not our greatest priority in light of this verse of the Holy Quran. Now, otherwise, if you understand the Arabic language, Yaqub alayhi salam did not ask his children, "Ma ta'kuluna min ba'di?" As one of the pious scholars asked a rhetorical question. Right? The focus of Yaqub alayhi salam for his children was not, how will you survive after me? Where will you get money? How will you earn a means of livelihood? Where will you get your degree? And so on. That was not his concern. He asked, who will you worship after me? So as Muslim parents, number one is getting our priorities in order and understanding our greatest priority and responsibility in light of this verse of the Holy Quran. And so that is our introduction, and that is what I first wish to establish. Moving on. So we will cover these 5 aspects which I've outlined in this PowerPoint presentation. However, my focus will be on the 5th aspect. Right? And so the first 4, I will go through, I will read the hadith, I'll explain. But my greatest focus, which I feel we need to give attention to, is this aspect of bonding. And is this aspect of creating that love and that connection between us and our children, and following the sunnah way, the prophetic way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how he bonded with the youth and how he bonded with his own children. So that will be my focus. However, I will go through these 5 aspects of our responsibility, and these 5, you can say, these 5 action items, or these 5 practical applications of our responsibility as parents. So the first one, the first aspect of our responsibility, or the first action item, is with regards to parents making dua for their children. Perhaps a lot of us do know about this. This is just as a reminder, just for us to realize how powerful our dua is and how readily accepted our dua is for our children. There is a famous hadith in Sahih Bukhari. I will not cover the entire hadith, but the words of the hadith, I'll simply summarize what happened. Ibn Jurayj was a pious person from the previous nations, and he did something to displease his mother. And as a result, his mother made the following dua: Ya Allah, la tumithu hatta yara wajhal mumisati. So, for whatever reason, Ibn Jurayj did not answer the call of his mother as he should have. He was offering nafil prayer. The scholars tell us that nafil salat, or voluntary prayer, depending on the situation, if our parents call us, that should take priority over nafil prayer. You can break your nafil salat or nafil prayer, and you can listen to the call of your parent. But nevertheless, Ibn Jurayj displeased his mother, and his mother was upset at him, so she made this following dua, respected friend and respected listener. Oh Allah, did not give him death until he sees the face of a prostitute. May Allah forbid. His mother was upset. That's why the scholars also tell us, be extremely careful in the words which come out of the parents' lips for the children. Because sometimes there's our acceptance, sometimes there's a specific time in which all du'as are accepted, and it should not be so that we make a negative dua, or as the term is used, bad dua, or a negative dua. It should not be such that we curse our children, or we make a dua that something bad happens to our children, and that specific dua is accepted. And specifically for the parents, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala holds them in such high esteem, and because their du'as are so readily accepted, especially parents should be careful. So this Ibn Jurayj, he displeased his mother, and she made this following dua: Oh Allah, do not give him death until he sees the face of a prostitute. And although it's a long story, Ibn Jurayj, the people of his town, wished to tempt him and wished to show him to be an impostor and false. They speak to a prostitute, a very beautiful prostitute. They make arrangement with her that she is to go and seduce Ibn Jurayj and tempt him. And she goes, she does her best, she tries, she fails. However, she gets involved with another man, with a shepherd. She becomes pregnant, and as soon as she gives birth, she blames Ibn Jurayj. She says Ibn Jurayj is the father of my children. The people of the town, they go and destroy his monastery. They go and they start abusing him, and they start expressing their anger at him. And it's a long story. At the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does save him, and the people, they realize the truth of Ibn Jurayj. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows a miracle at the hands of Ibn Jurayj. This young baby in the cradle, this baby speaks and points out who its father is, and Ibn Jurayj is absolved, and the people, he restores his previous respect and status, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saves him. However, the lesson we learn is it's not a good idea to have our parents make a negative dua against us. And as one of the wordings of the hadith indicates, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if the mother had made dua, the Ibn Jurayj prayed to the seduction of this woman, and Ibn Jurayj gave in to the seduction of this woman, then he would have done so. That is how powerful the dua of the mother and the parents are for the children, that if the mother had made dua, oh Allah, ensure that he commits fornication with a prostitute, and that dua would have come in effect, and it would have happened. It just so happened, the dua she made was, oh Allah, do not give him death until he sees the face of a prostitute. So this is the story of Ibn Jurayj, which emphasizes to us how powerful the dua of, specifically the mother, is for the children. There's also another dua which is recorded in Tirmidhi and Abu Dawood. ثلاث دعوات مستجابات دعاء الوالد ودعاء المسافر ودعاء المظلوم أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. This is a hadith which is authenticated by Ibn Hajar and which is recorded in numerous books of hadith, wherein Rasulullah ﷺ is reported to have said, 3 du'as are not rejected: the dua of the father, the dua of the traveler, and the dua of an oppressed person. Right, so the first hadith which we mentioned emphasized the power of the mother's dua, and the second hadith also mentions the power and acceptance of the father's dua. That whatever the father will make dua for his children, that dua will be accepted. So the scholars explain to us that there is no specific form or wording for making dua, which means if a person wishes to make dua in their own language, in their own words, right, they are free to use whatever wording they wish. And the key for dua is that it should be from the heart. So, if a person wishes to make dua for their children, right, I highly advise throughout the day, right, especially with the challenges which we are facing, and especially with the evils and the temptations and the challenges facing our children in the outside world. Right, I highly recommend making dua at tahajjud time, making dua in those hours of acceptance, for example, after salat, after every salat, when you're traveling, the parents making dua, for example, between azan and aqama, and throughout the day, making dua whenever you can for your children. Along with this, there are a number of duas which are recorded in the Holy Quran, which parents should memorize and make for their children. Meaning, of course, dua can be accepted, and inshallah, dua will be considered in any language, in any wording you wish to use. Oh Allah, protect my children. Oh Allah, accept my children for your religion. Oh Allah, bless my children. You can make dua in using whatever words and whatever language you wish to use. Inshallah, all these duas will be accepted. At the same time, we know that those duas taught to us by Allah SWT Himself in the Quran. Those duas are special. Those duas have special significance, and there's more blessings in those duas. So those duas, right, I highly recommend as parents, we should memorize those duas and make it a point to learn these duas and use these duas as much as we can. And I've made reference to these duas. I will mention where they're included in the Quran, and you can also refer to the PowerPoint presentation and look at the duas as well. So there's 3 duas which I highly recommend we all learn, and I will briefly translate them, and I will also give reference to where they are in the Quran. The first dua is in Surah Ibrahim, the 14th surah of the Quran, the 40th verse of the Quran. The 40th verse of Surah Ibrahim. So, the 14th surah of the Quran and the 40th verse of that surah. The Arabic reads as follows: رب اجعلني مقيم الصلاة ومن ذريتي ربنا وتقبل دعاء ربنا اغفر لي ولوالدي وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب. O Allah, make me someone who establishes salat and prayer, and also make my children among those who establish their salat and perform the salat. If we examine Surah Ibrahim, this was the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam, which he made at the time of leaving his wife Hajara alone in Mecca along with Ismail alayhi salam. And I don't have time, I'm not going to go into detail right now, but if you read the verses beforehand, you'll get a better idea of the context in which this dua was made. Right? Ibrahim alayhi salam was leaving his wife and child in a place without any water, without any food, in scorching heat in the middle of nowhere. And this is the dua which he was making. And note the emphasis on salat. He could have said, "Oh Allah, make my children good Muslims or practicing Muslims," but he specifically singled out salat to show how important salat and prayer is for our children. And then he goes on to say, "O my Lord, accept my dua. And O my sustainer, forgive me, forgive my parents, and forgive all the believers on the day in which reckoning will take place." So this is an excellent dua, and I highly recommend that we learn this dua and read this dua. The second dua is in Surah Furqan, the 25th Surah of the Holy Quran, verse 74. وَالَّذِينَ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ وَاجْعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. So, Ibad ar-Rahman, the special slaves of the Most Merciful, the special slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're the ones who use the following dua. "O Allah, grant us wives and children who will be a source of the coolness of our eyes." O Allah, make our wives and children a source of the coolness of our eyes. And the commentators here mentioned true coolness of the eyes for parents comes when our children practice Islam and they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not when they're millionaires, not when they're famous people and celebrities. True coolness of the eyes for parents will only be when our children practice Islam and live Islam. And the last part of this dua, "O Allah, and make us leaders of the righteous, leaders of the people of taqwa." So this is the second dua. The third dua is in Surah Ahqaf, the 46th Surah of the Holy Quran, and the 15th verse of Surah Ahqaf. So, Surah number 46, verse number 15. قال رب أوزعني أن أشكر نعمتك التي أنعمت علي وعلى والدي ونعمل صالحا ترضاه وأصلح لي في ذريتي. The person makes the following dua: "O my sustainer, O my Lord, give me the ability to thank you for your bounty which you have bestowed upon me, and that bounty which you have bestowed upon my children. And give me the ability to do good deeds which will make you happy. Or give me the ability to do good deeds which you will be happy with." And this last part of the dua is extremely powerful. "O Allah, you make my children righteous. O Allah, you make the islah, or you reform my children." This term is commonly used in the Arabic language and also in the Urdu language, the term known as islah, which literally means to make pious, but also means to rectify, to fix, to reform. There's many other meanings. But here we are asking Allah SWT directly. Right? Every single parent wants pious children. They want their children to change for the good, to start doing good. Here we are asking Allah SWT directly, "O Allah, you make the islah of my children, you reform them, you make them pious, and you make them righteous." So these are the three du'as directly from the Holy Quran, which I feel are extremely powerful, which I feel every single parent and every single Muslim should learn and read regularly. At the same time, dua is not enough. Right? And we hear our elders telling us that along with dua, there's also dawa. Meaning, there's two different aspects of our responsibility. Yes, of course, every single parent should pray for their children, but it doesn't stop there. And we have to employ the means, and we have to do our absolute best based on what is within our capacity. We need to completely carry out our responsibilities and obligations in carrying out the tarbiyah and nurturing our children and giving them that proper Islamic education and proper Islamic nurturing. And this is now our transition to our second action item, the responsibility of the Islamic of imparting Islamic education to our children. And I'll briefly touch upon this topic. This is our responsibility. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran says, "Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu qu anfusakum wa ahlikum nara." O people who believe, save yourselves and your families from the fire of hell. And here in the commentators, this is Surah Tahrim, the 66th verse of the Surah of the Holy Quran, and the 6th verse. So the commentators, including Ali radiallahu anhu and Ibn Kathir, they explain that the manner in which parents will save their children and their wives and themselves from the fire of hell will be through education. And Muqatil and Dahak, they write, حق على المسلم أن يعلم أهله من قرابته وإمائه وعبيده ما فرض الله عليهم وما نهاهم الله عنه. That we learn from this verse of the Quran that it is the responsibility of every Muslim and every believer that they teach their children and they teach their close relatives that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made obligatory upon them, that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made fard upon them, and that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbade them from. So from this verse and from other hadith and sayings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we learn that the second responsibility of parents is to give that proper Islamic education to our children, meaning that they learn that basic amount of knowledge which will enable them to live their lives as Muslims, to know what is mandatory upon them, to know what is forbidden upon them, to know what is halal upon them, and to know what is haram for them. So this is our basic responsibility, which would include teaching them the basics of fiqh, teaching them the basic rulings of salat, teaching them how to read the Quran, and so on. And this is normally the responsibility of what we call makatib, or even the parents as well, of teaching our children how to read the Quran, teaching them of the basics of Islam, and the absolute essentials of Islam, as Sheikh Faraz Rahmani has written in his book, that further aim, that knowledge which is mandatory for every single Muslim to know. So this is our responsibility, right? This is what our makatib, our Islamic schools, our different adult programs, and different programs in the masjid seek to teach. And I wanted to go into much detail. I simply wish to highlight this responsibility of the Islamic book education, or just the outer knowledge which every single Muslim should learn. Likewise, going on to our third responsibility or third action item, this is now beyond the book knowledge, teaching Islamic character, Islamic values, Islamic morals, and what is known as adab. And adab, just that etiquette and that manner in which you deal with others, and just the Islamic character. And also teaching them of the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and teaching them of Islamic values. I won't go into much detail, but there is something beyond that book knowledge, which is instilling those values and instilling the morals and the adab within our children's hearts and within our children. There's a famous incident. Abdullah bin Abbas, he was a young child. He was sitting on the animal in the back of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave this amazing advice to this young boy. This is a lesson, you can say it's a real life lesson or a practical lesson of the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And it's not necessarily a lesson, a formal lesson given in a house or given in a classroom. This is on an animal, right? This is now knowledge in action, as we call it, knowledge in action. I won't mention the whole hadith, but once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is sitting on the animal with Abdullah bin Abbas, he says, Ya ghulam, inni u'allimuka kalimatin, tahfaz Allah yahfazka, tahfaz Allah tajidhu tujahak, wa'alam anna al-ummata, law ijtama'at ala an yanfa'uka bishay'in, lam yanfa'uka bishay'in, illa qad katabahu Allah lak. ولو اجتمعوا على أن يضروك بشيء لم يضروك بشيء إلا قد كتبه الله عليك رفعت الأقلام وجفت الصحف أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. Also we translate here. The Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells Abdullah bin Abbas, "O Abdullah bin Abbas, O young boy, let me teach you a few words. Let me teach you a few things. Look after the commands of Allah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will look after you. Look after the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you will find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with you. You will find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His help. You will find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right in front of you. And know, if the entire world were to gather and try to harm you with something, or try to benefit you with something, they cannot benefit you in any way whatsoever unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has willed some benefit for you. And know, if the entire world were to gather and harm you in some way. They cannot harm you unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills. The pens have been raised and the scrolls and the predestination has already been finalized. This is just one example of going beyond that book knowledge and teaching these values to our children and teaching these concepts to our children. Not to lie, to be honest, to be kind with everyone, to be kind to the poor. We've seen, for example, our elders tell us, give your children money and teach them to give charity. Right? Teach them who poor people are. Take them to the poor. Take them to those areas. Let them learn about these things. And likewise, in fact, we can do an entire seminar on the advice which Luqman alayhi salam gave to his son. And I'll briefly read the verse and translate it. Again, this is that spiritual education, which goes beyond the book education, spiritual education, advising our children and inculcating that love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their hearts, and inculcating the love of the Prophet in their hearts, and inculcating those values in their hearts. It's not enough for our children just to be able to win an Islamic trivia and to answer all the questions on trivia correctly, but that love has to be nurtured in the hearts, and those values have to be nurtured in the hearts until they become a reality in their hearts. And look at the advice Luqman Hakim gave his, Luqman the wise gave his child, as recorded in Surah Luqman, the 31st Surah of the Quran, and the 16th verse. يا بني إنها إن تكن مثقال حبة من خردل فتكن في صخرة أو في السماوات أو في الأرض يأتي بها الله إن الله لطيف خبير. يا بني أقيم الصلاة وأمر بالمعروف وانهى عن المنكر واصبر على ما أصابك إن ذلك من عزم الأمور. Look at the tone and look at the manner in which a father would speak to their children. This is recorded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran. Oh my beloved son. You'll see this is the same way Ibrahim spoke to his children. This is the same way which Rasulullah would speak to the young people during his time. Right? With kindness, with love. Oh my beloved son. This is the type of word in the Arabic language known as Ism Tasghir or diminutive form. So Luqman alayhi salam says to his child, oh my beloved son, if there was a mustard seed found, if there was an atom's amount of a mustard seed, in other words, a mustard seed which is the size of an atom, extremely small amount, and if it were to be hidden in a boulder or rock, or if this mustard seed was, if this atom's amount is hidden somewhere in the skies or the earth, Allah SWT will bring it. Allah SWT is all knowing. Allah SWT is all aware and all knowing. Allah SWT is subtle and all knowing. In other words, Allah SWT's knowledge is infinite and He knows everything. Oh my son, be aware of this. And oh my son, establish salat, establish prayer, command to the good, forbid from the evil, and be patient upon what afflicts you. Verily that is from the resolute matters. Verily that is from the firm matter. Moving on to the next lesson, I will also briefly touch upon this. This is the lesson we learn from Ibrahim alayhi salam, and the lesson we learn, which we hear about the story which we hear about every year during Eid al-Adha, during Bakr Eid or Eid al-Adha. And I really think we should pay attention to these following verses, and really take lessons from these following verses. How a father should speak to their children, how we should speak to our children and treat them as adults, and treat them as mature people, and treat them as people who have intellect and who can think for themselves. When you acknowledge the intelligence of your child, and acknowledge that your child can think for himself, and when you treat him as an adult, then he will start behaving as an adult. And many people have written about this, the disappearance of childhood, and Neil Postman's book, that in the past, a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old child was a lot more mature than even our 15 or 18-year-old children today. I'm sorry. The whole concept of adolescence, the whole concept of rebelling, and children acting out and not being mature, this was not found in the past. We have created this whole concept of adolescence, as the book Disappearance of Childhood indicates, and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf has also indicated towards this as well. So nevertheless, I'll briefly touch upon the story, the famous story which we have heard on numerous occasions. Allah SWT in Surah Safat has recorded this conversation between father and son. And Allah SWT says that this is the story between Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam. When Ibrahim alayhi salam saw in a dream that he's slaughtering his son, and now he's approaching his son and discussing this with his son. فلما بلغ معه السعي قال يا بني إني أرى في المنام أني أذبحك فانظر ماذا ترى قال يا أبتي افعل ما تؤمر ستجدني إن شاء الله من الصابرين. So Allah SWT says, when Ismail alayhi salam reached the age of running around or walking with his father. Like some commentators, Abdul Mansur, they say this was around 8 years old, somewhere between 8 and 10 years old. So imagine our own children. I have a daughter who's 9 years old, I have a daughter who's 7 years old. Imagine us having the following conversation with our child, and in a way you're acknowledging that that child can think for themselves. You're speaking to that child as an adult. And if you look at child psychology, and if you look in the current books of parenting and so on, they discuss this concept. Whereas we as Muslims, we have been observing this for the last 1400 years. Right? Speaking to your children with respect, consulting with your children, seeing how they feel about something, and not just assuming that they can't think for themselves, taking their opinion and getting to know what they want. So here the father, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he knows what he has to do. He knows that he's been commanded to slaughter his son. However, he wants to test his son, and he wants to communicate with his son and get his son's feedback on this issue. So Allah SWT says, when Ismail alayhi salam reached the age of running, the father Ibrahim alayhi salam said, "O my beloved son, I see in a dream." Note the same word being used again, Ya Bunay. Whatever you speak to your children, whether you're commanding them to do something, whether you're discouraging them from something, the love should also be there. Being harsh is not Islamic teaching. It's something we need to work on. Remember, many a time, the same message a child would take and accept, or a child will rebel and throw a fit. It's the method of presentation. It's a matter of how we speak to our children. وَقُولَا لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا لَعَلَّهُ يَتَذَكَّرُ وَيَخْشَى. Allah SWT tells Musa alayhi salam, speak softly to Pharaoh. And the commentators say, who can be a greater transgressor or evil person who's more evil than Pharaoh? And who can be a pious person today who is better or more pious than Musa alayhi salam? Despite all this, Mufti Shafi explains that Allah SWT tells Musa alayhi salam, speak softly and kindly to Pharaoh. So this should be our method approach. This should be how we speak to our children at all times. And may Allah SWT give us the ability. So the father says, "O my beloved son, I see in a dream that I'm slaughtering you." So what is your take on this? What is your opinion on this? And note the way the father is speaking to the child. How do you feel about this? What is your ra'i? What is your opinion on this? I wish to see how you view things, and I want to get your take on it. And tell me what is your opinion on this. So now Allah SWT has recorded the statement of and the response of Ismail alayhi salam. So Ismail alayhi salam responds, right? And here in this response you could write volumes. Just as one response of the child speaks volumes on how he was brought up, how the relationship between the father and the son is, and how a relationship between a Muslim father and Muslim son should be. I really think this family of Ibrahim alayhi salam is a model family and living example for all Muslim families till the Day of Judgment. And the relationship between the father Ibrahim alayhi salam and his son Ismail alayhi salam should be a model for all Muslim parents till the Day of Judgment as well. How should be a relationship be between father and child or mother and child? and how we should bring up our children and what values we should inculcate and instill in our children. So this young child, imagine this young child, 8 years old, 10 years old. This is the response and the educated response and the response which this child gave to the father. "Oh, my father, do as you have been commanded. Oh, my father, I understand you are a prophet. I understand that you receive revelation from God. Oh, my father, do as you've been commanded. You will find me. If Allah wills, you will find me from among the patient. If Allah wills, you will find me from among the patient." And as the rest of the story, I will not go into the rest of the story, but the point again is for us to learn how to instill values in our children and how to instill the proper character, the proper adab, the proper values in our children. The famous statement, which is attributed to Imam Malik's mother, that when she sent him to seek knowledge, you'll see many books, entire books written on this concept of adab, and how it's not only the book knowledge, but we as students, or even we as parents, we should ensure that our children learn proper Islamic values and morals and proper Islamic character. And it's not only that knowledge is not a means within itself, but along with that knowledge, it should be accompanied by adab and values. And that's why the statement says, the mother says, "Ta'allam min adabihi qabla ilmihi." Learn from the manners of your teacher, the character of your teacher, the values and the etiquettes of your teacher before you seek his knowledge. You will find people of the past would spend years in the company of a pious person, not only learning knowledge, not only seeking book knowledge, but inculcating your teacher's values, inculcating your teacher's habits and good values and good character. This was a practice of the people of the past. Sometimes they would spend up to 20 years in the company of their teacher, not only seeking knowledge, but learning from their values, learning from their adab. And really, I believe, I've discussed this in the past, this is probably our greatest field of deficiency. Right? Yes, book knowledge, to some extent, our children are receiving, but especially children in the West, they are severely lacking in adab. And I've traveled in different parts of the world. I can say that specifically children living in the United States, in the West, that they are severely lacking in this. My own children, even the people I know, if you go to other cities and other parts of the world, the children really, they have something beyond the basic adab or basic etiquette. They know how to respect scholars. They know how to honor people, how to treat people. They know how to host people for food. They have different values which many people in the West don't know how to, that aren't even aware of. Right? I'll just give an example. I was in South Africa, and a 17 or 18-year-old boy, he hosted us at his house. Right? So these are skills, right? These are lifelong skills which everyone should learn. But unfortunately, many of our children here in the West, they go to school, they don't learn these things. If someone comes to your house, how do you greet that person? How do you host them for food? How do you serve food? How do you make small talk? How do you look after them? How do you cater to their needs? And how do you now serve food? And how do you now host them and take care of them? Taking care of a guest. These are part of the Islamic values. This is just as important as that book knowledge, which tells us what the rights of a guest is, for example. So the other amazing story which I wish to share, that giving our children a spiritual education and a teaching of spiritual values beyond that basic book knowledge. And this is a story recorded by Imam Ghazali in his Ihya al-Ulumuddin. It's an amazing story. You can you can see the reference of this book as well. There was a pious person in the past whose name was Sahal ibn Abdullah al-Bustari. And he says this, that I was a boy at the age of 3 years old. And I used to stay awake at night. And I used to see my maternal uncle, whose name was Muhammad ibn Sawar. My maternal uncle, my mother's brother, his name was Muhammad ibn Sawar. So at the age of 3, imagine the child remembering this. Imagine the impact this had, the spiritual education, imagine the impact it had on this child. So the maternal uncle says, why do you not remember the being who's created you? At the age of 3, you're introducing your child to who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. So the child says, how do I remember God? How do I remember Allah? So the maternal uncle says, whenever, once a day, say 3 times in your mind without saying this on your tongue. Allahu ma'i, Allahu nazir ilay, Allahu shahidi. Allah is with me, Allah is watching me, Allah is present with His knowledge. So this is the teaching which this pious uncle is giving to the child at the age of 3. So he says, the child says, for a few days I start saying this. And then I informed my uncle that I've started saying this every day. Now the uncle says, why don't you say it 7 times a day, 7 times a night? He says, I just told my uncle this as well. Then he says, okay, then say it 11 times a night. And now know what he says. He says, at the age of 3, the sweetness of this statement and the sweetness of these words penetrated into my heart. In other words, at the age of 3, the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His omnipresence and His infinite knowledge, that reality of that has entered into the hearts of this child. After a year, his uncle says, memorize what I have taught you and remain constant on this, remain perpetual on this until you enter your graves, because it will help you in this world and in the hereafter. He says, for many years I started saying this. At the age of 3, he's learned this practice and it stayed with him for many years. Now, many years later, this is that what we call tarbiyah. Right? They say tarbiyah means gradually teaching and giving that amount of knowledge which is appropriate for the occasion, right? Starting off with the basics and building up. The tarbiyah means teaching gradually or nurturing gradually. Right? Our responsibility as parents cannot be done by one magic overnight session or one magic overnight weekend at a religious program. Tarbiyah and bringing up our children is something we have to do day in and day out on a daily basis throughout our children's childhood. It is something that has to be done every day and gradually and consistently, not something, well, I have a day off, so I'll spend the time and I'll take my child to the masjid. Or once a year, I'll take my child to this Islamic event or a conference, and my responsibility as a parent is done. So now the build-up, one day the father says, or the uncle says, oh Sahal, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with a person, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching that person, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is present with that person, can that person disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Once you know who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, can you disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So after 3 or 4 years of impressing this concept in the child's mind, now he says, if you know who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, how can you ever disobey Him? So he says, stay away from disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any way, shape or form. So this child says, after this education, spiritual education from my maternal uncle, I used to spend time by myself. And I learned the Quran and memorized it when I was at the age of 6 years old or 7 years old. But friends, this is what I mean to say, that beyond that basic book knowledge or the teaching of fiqh, we need to teach these values to our children. And that's why they say the first madrasa of the child, the first source of Islamic education for the child is the mother's lap. And I do recommend, it's been highly effective. The scholars before us, they say, we should make it a point to have ta'aleem in our houses and to have Islamic education imparted daily from our houses. This is in light of the whole verse of the Holy Quran, وَاذْكُرْنَ مَا يُتْلَى فِي بُيُوتِكُنَّ مِنْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ وَالْحِكْمَةِ, where Allah SWT tells the females, remember the verses of the Quran that are recited in your houses, and remember that wisdom which is recited in your houses. So on this basis, the scholars tell us that to create that positive environment at home, we should be reading from a book of hadith, ideally from Riyadh Salihin, Fadail A'mal, whichever book you like, but we should have some Islamic education, some positive message daily to our children at home. Which brings us to our fourth action item, positive reinforcement at home. And looking at our children, looking at the world today, our children really need role models. They need positive examples. They see the world is going one direction, And now we are telling them, offer your prayers, offer your salat, practice Islam, live as a Muslim. The key needs to be that we ourselves, first of all, before anything else, we ourselves as parents should be positive role models, and we should live Islam 100%. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu udkhulu fis-silmi kaffa. All people who believe, enter Islam completely. Enter into Islam 100%. So, any parent, anyone who has children knows, within 1 or 2 years, when a child is about 1 or 2 years old, we all observe this. Our children, they copy us. Our children, when they see us wearing shoes, they will be cute. They will start wearing our shoes and imitating us. In the same way, if the children see us reading salat, or see the mother reading salat, they'll also start reading the salat. If they see the mother wearing a hijab and covering herself, they'll also imitate things. Right? They observe everything, and they absorb everything as well. They observe everything, and they absorb everything they see. If you see the parents swearing, they'll start swearing. If you see the parents giving charity, these things play in the person's mind. Right? I vividly remember as a young child, right? There's a certain education we receive from our parents, and there's a certain practical education, which you don't learn in books. There's a certain practical education we pick up from our parents. And as a very young boy, I vividly remember my father, whenever he would travel somewhere with other family or aunts and uncles and so on, he would go first into the toll booth, he would go first into the parking lot, and he would pray for everyone else. Like this generosity. Like generosity, one is teaching about the virtues of generosity in books. One is positive reinforcement at home, observing it in your own parents, and seeing a living example of it. And perhaps those who know me, they will tell you that I do my best to be a generous person, but I can attribute it back to my father. Whether he even remembers this, whether he even acknowledges this, the truth of the matter is, it's something I learned from my father. It's something which I used to see him doing at a young age. He would always pay the bill. He would always give money to other people. I used to see him, he used to always help out other people. It's something I observed from a very young age. And something interesting which Sheikh Hamza Yusuf mentioned in one of his lectures, labeling theory. That what do we call our children? What names or positive terms do we use for our children? Because a name ends up being a self-fulfilled prophecy. Like if you say, oh, evil child, oh, good-for-nothing child, oh, child who is worthless, this affects the self-esteem of the child. It stays over with that child. Whereas if you use good terms, oh, pious child, oh, good child, oh, hafiz child, oh, child who's memorized the Quran, oh, good Muslim child, whatever positive terms you use, right? Oh, imam child, whatever it is. When we use positive terms, they stay with our children. They end up becoming self-imposed prophecies. And likewise, I did mention that story. Zubair radiallahu anhu, in one of the greatest battles of the history of Islam, the Battle of Yarmouk, he has a young son. He makes it a point to take that young son with him. This is that practical education. That if we go to Islamic program, if we are giving a lecture, if we go to help someone out, now we take our children with us. They get to observe us in practice. They get to see how we behave. They get to see how we help others. They observe how we slaughter an animal. They observe how we give charity to other people. So at the age of 14, there's a young child, like Zubair radiallahu anhu does not say his child is immature. He does not say his child is not up to it. He personally takes his child with him to this great battle of Islam, and he assigns someone to look after this child. So at the age of 14, Ibn Asakir mentions, at the age of 14, Abdullah bin Zubair, who ended up becoming a great warrior of Islam, and ended up becoming one of the Muslim leaders for some time as well. And one of the most greatest heroes who showed great valor and great courage and bravery in the conquest of Egypt and also the conquest of Libya. I don't have time to go into much detail. Amazing story which is mentioned on how he single-handedly took down the leader of the Christian Empire, or specifically it was the Roman Empire at the time. That this one man, he walks in the enemy lines and he takes out the leader of the enemies, the emperor of the enemies, single-handedly. So where did he learn his bravery from and valor from? From practically being with his father at this great battle and learning this from his battle and learning this from his father. So now this takes us on to our last point, and this is the point which I wish to emphasize a little bit more, because I see a lot of weakness in my own friends, in some of the children and the youth which I worked with, and specifically in the religious circles. And what I've observed is we do encourage our children, we do push our children, we do our best that they become pious, they wear Islamic clothing, they memorize the Quran, they go to the masjid, and they do these different things. However, what I notice is sometimes with parents, we do all this, but we don't have that strong bond with our children while we're doing this. And our children we don't have that love, we don't have that strong connection with our children. And sometimes we just push too much in one direction. Right? We expect them to read the Quran, we expect them to read their prayers, we expect them to memorize the Quran, to go to Islamic classes. But at the same time, sometimes it is us pushing them to do so without them being motivated themselves, and without us having that bond with them or creating that bond or love and desire in our children to do these things. So what ends up happening, these children grow up with some resentment, they grow up feeling deprived, they weren't able to do all these fun things their friends did. All they had to do is sit and read the Quran all day, or they decide to go to the masjid all day, and they feel like they're missing out. And unfortunately, it's a common trend. Many of these youths, when they're growing up, they're rebelling. Sometimes they become scholars and they rebel. Sometimes they become scholars, they feel they're deprived. Sometimes they memorize the Quran, but they fall and they fall hard. And I can say it's almost an epidemic. It reaches the levels it has reached epidemic levels within our Muslim community. MashaAllah, the parents mean well, they're very religious, they want their children, they want very much that their children follow in their footsteps to become religious. But I truly believe sometimes they're pushing too hard, and I truly believe sometimes they don't have that same bond with their children, and the children really aren't doing it for themselves. They are being pressured, or they're being pushed to do certain things. That's why this fifth aspect, developing a bond with our children, right? It's sometimes we end up making religion for these children, we end up making it very dry for them, and it's just reading your salat, nothing else. And we as parents, we don't have a relationship or a bond beyond taking them to the masjid, beyond praying with them, and that's it. So there are certain incidents and certain lessons I believe we can learn from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how he used to bond with the child, and how he used to bond with his youth, how he used to bond with his own children, and how he used to bond with the youth of his time. So the key is, if a child does something and they feel they're being forced into it, they don't really want to do it, they resent their parents, they're not really doing it because they want to do it themselves, they're doing it for the parents. That child, when he grows up, that child will have major problems, that child will rebel, that child will have resentment towards Islam, will have resentment towards their parents. Whereas on the other hand, even if the child doesn't go all out, even if the child doesn't become a scholar, doesn't memorize the Quran, doesn't do all these great things, but whatever the child does out of love. Whatever the child does with a strong bond with the parents. I truly believe that is more productive, that is more healthy, that is better in the long run than pushing our children to do things which they really don't want to do themselves, or they really don't know why they're doing them. So, after observing Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam being the best of teachers and being the best of parents as well, there's a few lessons that I wish to share and a few examples which I wish to share with us. And you can see clearly whoever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came into contact with, and especially the youth who he came into contact with, you can see that strong bond there. You can see that love, and you can see the teaching methods and the parenting methods, which were the behavior methods which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used with the youth of his time, and how he created that bond, and how he created that love, and how he would do fun things with his children as well. This is something which I wish to discuss as well, that Islam is not only praying with our children, there's also other things we can do as well. There's also permissible things we can do as well. We can call it halal fun. We can call it bonding activities. We can call it Islamic sports. And we can call it just different activities parents can do with their children to develop that bond, to develop that love, and so that child, it's not only a formal relationship, but there's also fun going on. There's also that bond. That child likes to be with us. That child respects us. That child loves us. And that child is willing to do whatever we tell them because they love us, not because they're being forced to do so. And I believe one of these examples is specifically the example of Anas bin Malik. Amazing. At the age of 10, his mother, Sulaim, brings him to the company of Rasulullah and says, "Oh Rasulullah, this child, I have dedicated this child for your service and to tend after your needs and to care for you." So this child at the age of 10, he spends 10 years in the company of Rasulullah. And look at that bond, respected friends. Look at that bond and look at that relationship. He says that I served Rasulullah for 10 years. And he never said no to me at any time. He never said no to me at any time. And he says that even when during that time, there was occasions where I didn't feel like doing what Rasulullah wanted me to do. Right? But he never said no to me. He never rebuked me. He was never harsh with me. He was always kind with me. And as the incident says, Rasulullah sent him for some work. On the way, some children were playing, and he got caught up. He got busy with some play, and Rasulullah sees him from the back. "Oh, Anas, what are you doing? Aren't you carrying out what I told you to do?" Right? So the child, even though the child had some rebellious nature in him, in the beginning, he didn't want to do what Rasulullah told him to do, but out of love, showing that compassion, he ended up doing what Rasulullah wanted him to do anyways. And he himself, he observes Rasulullah treated him like a daughter. Rasulullah told him the secrets. Rasulullah trusted him and trusted him with his own secrets, as mentioned. And he himself said, imagine 10 years you being with a person, that person never rebukes you, that person is never mean to you, that person never says no to you, and imagine that bond relationship. But friends, that relationship between Rasulullah and Anas bin Malik, this is how we should be with our own children. Imagine that he looks at Rasulullah as his hero, he looks at Rasulullah as his father, he looks at Rasulullah as his role model, and he's willing to do whatever Rasulullah tells him to do. Whether he feels like it, or he doesn't feel like it. And this was the effect of that bond, this was the effect of that nurturing, and the kindness, and winning over the person. Rasulullah would win over the hearts of the youth. He would win over the hearts of his children. And people would be willing to do whatever he told them to do without him forcing it, without him insisting on it, and without him using violence or using corporal punishment or discipline or anything else. People on their own, out of their own desire and free will, they will be willing to do whatever Rasulullah told them to do. Children and youth, of their own desire and free will, would be willing to do whatever Rasulullah told them to do, whether they felt like it, whether they wanted to do it. His wish was their command. And there's another interesting story I wish to share with you as well. Again, those parenting methods, winning over a person. Even when that person is being negative with us, even when that child is rebelling against us, even when that child is making fun of us. This is the world we're living in as parents. Right? Sometimes that child will even mock us, make fun of us. And we have to be able to deal with it. We have to be able to bear patiently and still win that child over and still get through to that child. It's an amazing story which is recorded in the tafsir of the Holy Quran under Surah Ma'idah. This is verse 57. I'll mention this in brief. We're about to stop in a few minutes. It's a story in brief. There was a young person by the name of Abu Mahdura. Right? So, if you look at the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was the best of teachers. There's entire books, even the English language, on his teaching methods and how he got through to the youth. And I highly recommend, if I will send a link, there is an English translation of this book, Rasul al-Mu'allim, the prophetic teacher, or Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a teacher. So I would venture to say that every type of teaching method and every aspect of how to get through to youth and to deal with any teaching situation. As we know, there's many situations that come up, parenting situations or teaching situations. I would venture to say that in the Sunnah and the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, every aspect and every surrounding issue with as parents, or every possible scenario that we can face as parents, we will find guidance in the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what happens once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was coming back from Hudaybiyah? This is in Tafsir ibn Kathir from Hunayn. And there's a group of youth. They hear Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam traveling with his companions, and they hear the adhan being given. And so imagine Muslims are passing by. There's a group of non-Muslim kids. They hear the adhan, and they start screaming and copying the adhan and making fun of it. So imagine how we would react. We see someone making fun of Islam. We see a bunch of youth making fun of Islam and making fun of the Quran. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam hears their voice, and he says, "Where are those kids? Bring those kids to me. Bring those youth to me." Then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Ayyukum alladhi sami'tu sawtahu qad irtafa." There's many of you. One of you was the ringleader. One of you was raising his voice, and he was the ringleader of this group. So everyone says it's Abu Mahdura. It's the narrator of the story. So Rasulullah let them all go, and he kept Abu Mahdura. He says, "Oh Abu Mahdura, stand up and give the adhan." So before he's making fun of the adhan, now Rasulullah says, "Stand up and give the adhan." And he himself says, فَقُمْتُ وَلَا شَيْءَ أَكْرَهُ إِلَيَّ مِنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ وَلَا مِمَّا يَأْمُرُنِي بِهِ. He says, I'm in the company of this adult, I'm in the company of this teacher, and there's nothing which is more hated to me than this teacher. And there's nothing more hated to me than what he's about to tell me what to do. So full stop there. Rebellious child, rebellious student, someone who hates you, someone who hates what you're about to say. So Rasulullah himself, no one else is there, he himself teaches a young person how to say the adhan. Even though the kid is making fun of the adhan, Rasulullah takes out the time and teaches him the whole adhan. Then he says, he gives him a gift. He gives him a bag full of silver. And he puts his hand on my forehead. And he passes it on my face. And he passes his hand on my chest. And this is, as we know, blessing, giving those blessings to this person, right? That's physical connection with our children. And physical connection with the youth. And then he makes a dua. Rasulullah says, Barakallahu fika wa baraka alayk. Oh Allah, may Allah bless you and bless you in difficult situations. At this point, Abu Mahdura stands up and all the hatred is gone. And he now becomes a Muslim. He loves Islam. And he becomes one of the great mu'azzineen, meaning he becomes one of the great people who reads the azan from all the Muslims. And in fact, he's assigned to read the azan in Makkah. He becomes the mu'azzin of Makkah. And Rasulullah sends him to be the mu'azzin of all the people of Makkah. So, respected listeners, the point which I'm trying to make here is that it's also about winning over the heart of the child. It's also about winning over the mind of the child. It's also about bonding with that child and having a strong contact with the child. We shouldn't have a cold relationship where the child does what he wants and we just give him commands and that's it. It's about taking out time, quality time with our children. It's about also doing things which fun activities and halal activities with our children. To such an extent, in this book, Rasul al-Mu'allim, in which they discuss how Rasulullah was as a teacher. There's an aspect of teaching through humor, in which Rasulullah would teach young people and use this unconventional method, teaching through humor. Teaching through humor. And there's an amazing incident which I wish to share with you regarding this incident which took place during the lifetime of Rasulullah and this young child who coincidentally was also the brother of Anas bin Malik. So imagine a 3-4-year-old child, and imagine now getting through to that child and focusing on that bond, teaching that child will come later, from a young age, establishing that bond with that child. So Anas bin Malik, the same Anas bin Malik who we mentioned earlier, he says, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يدخل علينا ولي أخ صغير يكنى أبا عمير وكان له نغر يلعب به فمات فدخل عليه النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ذات يوم فرآه حزينا فقال ما شأنه؟ قالوا مات نغره فقال يا أبا عمير ما فعل النغير. So a beautiful hadith which is recorded in Sahih Bukhari, which is recorded in Muslim, and many of the books of hadith. That Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to visit the family of Anas bin Malik, and as a young child, a few years old, maybe 5 years old, 6 years old, his name was Aba Umair. And he used to have this bird in the cage. He used to have this small sparrow he used to play with. And at the end of the hadith, I'll mention some of the lessons and some of the points which we can derive from this hadith. So Anas bin Malik says, this bird passed away. This young child had a pet bird, and the bird passed away. So one day Rasulullah came in and saw the child who was sad. So cheering up the child, being friendly, being jovial with the child, winning over the heart of the child. Rasulullah asked, what happened to Abu Umair? Why is he sad? So they said, his bird passed away, his sparrow passed away. So Rasulullah said one line, and this is really from the miraculous aspects of Rasulullah's speech. Rasulullah was given comprehensive speech. One sentence would have pages and pages of meaning, volumes and volumes of meaning. Rasulullah told his child, it rhymes in the Arabic language, so you can truly appreciate it in the Arabic language. Ya Aba Umair, ma fa'al al-Nughair. O Abu Umair, the child's name was Abu Umair. O Abu Umair, what happened to your sparrow? Where's your sparrow? What happened to your sparrow? I don't see it. From this one hadith, there's entire books written on this one hadith. And I have copies of these books here. Over 300 lessons are derived from this one incident. Over 300 lessons can be derived from this one incident. But specifically, which I wish to cover right now, so among the lessons we learn here from this incident is teaching through humor, or getting through to a person through humor. I can recall in my own life, my 13-year-old son, there were times where he would not listen to me, where he was completely rebellious, he was crying, he wouldn't hear me at all. And I vividly remember joking around with him, calling him with his nickname. I give him the nickname Abu Halawa, the father of sweets. That's the nickname I usually call him by. So he's not getting out of the car, he's crying for minutes on end, he doesn't want to come into the program, and I start joking with him, and finally he starts opening up, and he starts listening to what I say. So teaching through humor, or teaching through unconventional methods. So among the lessons we learn from this incident, joking around with children, right? We're sometimes lightening things up sometimes, right? Not being this strict and hard person like a robot, opening up, joking around with our children, having fun with them. And so the narrations mention Rasulullah used to joke around with us. Right? The narration also mentioned this. كان يمازحنا كان يضحكنا. There's entire books written on Rasulullah's humor. And so this is also mentioned in the books. You also learn from among the lessons that there are halal games or fun games which are permissible in Islam, which a person can do with children. And one of them, Rasulullah saw this pet bird. He saw the cage. He did not say anything against it, or he did not say it's wrong. Meaning, we learn you can play with children, and you can spend money on playful things with children as well. And as I alluded to earlier, there are certain halal activities or permissible activities we can do with our children. Rasulullah emphasized teaching swimming to our children. Swimming is an important life skill. It develops skin tone, it develops muscle tone, it develops physical ability and physical endurance. Right? This mentioned in numerous hadith. There are entire books written on the sunnah practice of swimming. Likewise, archery, teaching our children archery. One of my good friends, he got a good deal on a Groupon, so he takes his children and he does archery with them, and they know how to shoot a bow and arrow. Right? Imam Shafi was a great archer. Imam Bukhari was a great archer. And Rasulullah emphasized learning archery. And likewise wrestling. In front of Rasulullah, Abu Rafi, these other youth, they used to wrestle, they used to show who's stronger, right? Wrestling, and these different activities. Right? So there are other ways. What I wish to say, supplement it's the whole package. All the 5 action items which I've laid out in front of you. Right? We need to supplement it. And this 5th one will keep things interesting, will ensure that that bond is also there with our children. Right? So doing different things, right? Going out for hikes, going out for nature trips, going out swimming with our children, going out exploring with our children. Right? There's different, racing with our children, doing activities with our children, playing sports with our children. And this is the attempt which I've been making with my own children, and this is the approach which I really think is important, that we spend that childhood with we spend that time in our children's childhood making an impact, winning over their hearts, showing them kindness, and to such extent that they respect us, they value us as parents, and they're not waiting for us to reach the age of 18 where they can run off and they can leave us for good. Right? That love is there, that bond is there. And that's why if you follow me online, I put my adventures of Mufti and Son. I do different activities with my children, and I do my best to establish that bond. And certain things, certain life lessons a child will learn, they'll only learn it through the practical, the school of hard knocks. In other words, life. Right? Just a few incidents. I'll end on this. A few incidents. I was recently traveling with my son and my family in the Caribbean, and we were fishing. And Allah Subhanahu will. This is not something I can control, but sometimes Allah Subhanahu helps us out and assists us in giving these lessons of life. So we were on a fishing boat. It was a charter boat, and it was my son's turn. So we took. There's 5 fishing rods. Each person gets a turn to get the next fish. So I told my son, "Oh my son, I'm praying for you. I'm making dua for you. Oh my son, inshallah, you're going to get the biggest fish." And this is what I told him. I told him, inshallah, it's going to be a good experience. You're going to catch the biggest fish of all of them. And again, it's beyond my control. But we mentioned earlier that the dua of the father is readily accepted. And it just so happened, perhaps the biggest fish I've ever caught in my life, big 40-pound yellowfin tuna. My son and I both caught it together. He enjoyed it. He was holding the rod. I assisted him. Right? It was very difficult, but it was a lesson for life. And I'm sure he now appreciates his father. It was a fun experience as well. It's something hopefully he'll remember his whole life. But it's also a lesson, the power of the father's dua, and it's just learning to respect your father, to making sure your father's on your side. Your parents are making dua for you. Sheikh Sulaiman Mullah used to tell us that before he gives a lecture, he always calls his mother and asks how she's doing and asks her to make dua for him. So, nevertheless, there's many other incidents, there's many other stories. We can spend hours and hours talking about this. I will simply mention the 5 action items or the 5 practical steps we should take as parents. And inshallah, I'll end on this, and inshallah, I will open up for Q&A. I will just summarize my lecture and summarize the 5 action items. Get my papers. Okay. So, I said, number 1, as a recap for the seminar, or for this webinar, number 1 was us realizing our responsibility as the Muslim community, as parents specifically. The greatest responsibility on our shoulders is passing on Islam and passing on Islamic values to the next generation and to the next generation after that, and worrying about our future Muslim generation, and ensuring that our children will also pass on the baton and continue the legacy. That is our greatest responsibility and greatest priority. Then the 5 action items which I covered. Number 1, making dua for our children. Both mother and father making dua for our children and learning the Quranic duas, which I had mentioned. The second action item I had mentioned was passing on that further ayn knowledge, or that basic knowledge which our children will need, that the child knows how to read the Quran, that the child knows the basics of Islam, and the basics of salat, fasting, and so on. The third action item which I mentioned was the spiritual education, and teaching our children Islamic values, Islamic character, and adab, and Islamic etiquettes. The fourth action item was positive reinforcement at home, us being examples for our children, us talking, not only talking the talk, but walking the walk, and being living examples of Islam for our children. And the fifth action item, creating that bond between us and our children, doing fun activities with them, winning their hearts over, showing them love, and doing these different activities with them, and just establishing that strong bond with them. So that is my presentation for today. And so I will open it up for Q&A. And if anyone has any questions, if someone could also, I made reference to a few books. I will also try to forward the links to those books. Maybe put them on my social media. Maybe you can forward those links. So that is my presentation. I don't think I can cover all aspects of Muslim parenting, but I simply wish to at least touch on some of the main concepts, and at least give an introduction. Look at this as an introduction. There's much more that can be said, and there's many other scholars out there, many other people who can add and further the discussion at hand. So with that, I will end the lecture. If anyone has any questions or any follow-up points, so feel free to share them with us and share your feedback and present your questions to us.
Jazakumullah khair, Sheikh Mufti Abdullah Nana, for that fascinating discussion on Muslim parenting. So inshallah, for the questions, as Mufti Abdullah has mentioned, he's going to be taking some questions. So a few ground rules. So if you can just type those out in the chat box, inshallah, and we can look at them. Please mention your name and your location with your question, inshallah. So we'll take your questions now. So the questions are actually on the chat box. Do you want me to read them, or would you be able to just look at them yourself?
If you could read them, if you don't mind, you can read them.
Okay,
everyone can
sure.
everyone hear it too.
Sure, absolutely. Right. So the first question from Brother Latif: when we are growing up? It's a long question. We rebelled against Allah. As we get older, we become religious. Now today's children may demand like freedom, claiming that they have the option to become religious when older. So because we are not religious when we are young. So how should we address this issue? Should we admit them our wrongs and make dua for them? That's the question.
Yeah. Very good question. It's there's different ways you can answer it. But what I would say is that no matter what we did, right? They say every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. And many of us, myself included, we didn't have the best of childhoods. We had our turbulent times. But I would still say that no matter what we went through as children, that still does not absolve us of our responsibility. We still have to carry out our responsibility regardless. And perhaps one way would be, like I often tell my children, I said, look, learn from my mistakes. Right? There were periods of time where I made certain mistakes. I wasn't offering my salat. I wasn't doing certain things. Learn from our mistakes. And still, as parents, I still believe we have to do our absolute best. I've outlined the 5-step action plan. We still have to do our best. Yes, let them choose for themselves. But that still means we have to put in 100% and do our absolute best to give them the proper nurturing. Whether they accept or whether they become pious or not, that's not in our hands. But the effort and adopting the means is in our hands. We still have to do 100% our responsibility. And whether they become religious or not, whether they memorize the Quran or become scholars, that's in Allah's hands. That we do not control. And it doesn't make sense to force our children in the time and the era we're living in. It doesn't make sense to force our children. There's a story I did want to share in my lecture, which I didn't get a chance to mention, and it's tied into this question. So there's a teacher of mine. This teacher of mine, I studied with him in South Africa, and I really learned a lot of wisdom and tact from this teacher. You can imagine any person who's a scholar, any person who studied the Quran, they want their children to follow in their footsteps. But as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we push too much. And we don't let the children decide for themselves. We don't wait till the we don't wait till the child is motivated to do it on its own, on his or her own. So this teacher of mine, he's a little bit unconventional. His son, you can imagine he wanted his son to memorize the Quran and to become a scholar, but his son didn't immediately do that. And I can tell you, many parents, for us, it's my way or the highway. It's kind of, our son has to do what we want, otherwise we'll be disappointed with him for our whole life, and we won't support him. It's kind of like many Muslim parents, it's doctor or bust. You become a doctor or bust, that's it. There's no other option. But many of us are very rigid and severe. So this teacher of mine, his son, he decided to go to university and he got a job. So at the age of 18 or 19, the prime years of studying and becoming a scholar, the son did not follow in his father's footsteps. And he was caught up, he was watching movies, doing different things. So the father, he tolerated it all, but the father, I can tell you, the father had that love for the son. And the father, to such an extent, that father would sometimes go pick that son up from the movie theater itself. Right? So the father continued, he did his best. At the age of 25, the son, he'd worked for 5 years, he'd gone to university. Now the son on his own wanted to become a scholar. So the son, he learned the hard way. The son, he knew what his father wanted, but the son came to a realization on his own. And now the son, I think he graduated last year, he became a scholar. I can tell you that scholar and that son is going to be a greater scholar and more effective and more stronger scholar than someone who was kind of forced into it at the age of 18 or 17, didn't want to do it, and the father kind of pressured him into it. So I can say that the approach this teacher of mine used, this is the approach I would use. Right? Speak to your children. Let them decide for themselves. Oh, my son, how do you feel about memorizing the Quran? Oh, my daughter, how do you feel about wearing the hijab? Oh, my daughter, how do you feel about going to these classes? Right? Let them make that decision for themselves. Encourage them, but don't force them and don't push them too much. So I think there is a middle ground. And at the same time, I think the main issue is our past mistakes, they're done. Because of our past and because of our childhood, that doesn't mean we can be any deficient in carrying out our responsibility as parents. We still have to go 100%. No matter what we did as a childhood, our past behavior doesn't justify our being loose with our children or our not carrying out our responsibility as a children. Yeah, but there is a difference between forcing them to not do evil things or keeping them away from evil things by force and encouragement. And I think at this time and age, encouraging our children and using encouragement is more effective than using force or using discipline or corporal punishment or anything else. Next question.
Okay. Yeah. So the next question is from Brother Abdullah Nana from Florida. So he's asking about taking children to carnivals. Is that is that recommended? What are some halal things that we can do with our children?
Yeah. I would say as parents, you want to do your best to stick to Islamic environments or positive environments. Ideally, there should be no music there. Ideally, there should be no scantily clad females there. Ideally, there should be no alcohol and so on there. So it's a matter of looking for, with being creative, and looking for good halal venues for our children. I think the challenge with carnivals, of course, is going to be music. There's going to be people dressed up in a certain way. I would do my best to stick to better environments. And there are things. I mentioned a number of possible activities. Taking them to a secluded beach, or taking them going early in the day where there's not a lot of people. Taking them hiking, taking them swimming, taking them, for example, making arrangements, private pools, private ice skating places. There's plenty of activities and events. Taking them for hikes. There's certain sports. I play sports with my own children. So there's a number of activities which I mentioned: wrestling, swimming, archery. There's many other possibilities. But I would try to keep it within the Islamic parameters and try to ensure that it's an Islamic environment as much as possible.
Okay, Jazakumullah. So, Brother Yusuf from the United Kingdom, he is asking, how do we balance bad company in relations with keeping ties? I'm assuming that means that, having relatives who are considered bad company. So how do we balance that?
Yeah. I think that's a detailed subject you could spend a whole lecture discussing. There is a balance to when you can maintain ties with a person, say salam to them, be on cordial terms with the person, and as opposed to having our children stay at the house for 4 or 5 days and pick up the wrong habits and pick up the wrong values. But there's a middle ground. My point is there's a middle ground. It is very difficult. It's a topic within itself. What if your relatives have televisions? What if your relatives play music in their homes? What if they have un-Islamic things in their homes? It is a challenge. And sometimes it's a struggle as well. But just that keeping that general principle in mind, there are ways to keep your ties with the person without getting too close. And if you see that a particular relative is being a negative influence on your children, you want to minimize your contact with that person while at the same time maintaining ties with that person and not cutting them off completely. And in the extreme situation where that person, whatever has done negative things to us, or whatever has done something unacceptable, even the Islamic, you can consult with the scholars, there are situations where you're allowed to cut off ties with the person on certain extreme situations. You can discuss with your local scholar if that's the case or not. But I would say the general advice is looking for ways to protect our children and protect them from negative influences while at the same time maintain our family ties.
Okay, so there are a few questions which are similar, so I'm just going to pair them up. So there was one about indoor swimming pools, so that got addressed with the answer you gave on the carnivals, because it's ultimately about the environment. There's another question about the Islamic stance on spanking. Yeah.
Okay, that's a lot of these questions. I think you can spend a great deal of time discussing, and really you could. We could spend probably another seminar on some of these topics. Right? Islam, in light of the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Islam does give permission to use corporal punishment as a whole. Right? مروا أولادكم بالصلاة وهم أبناء 7 سنين واضربوهم عليها وهم أبناء 10 سنين. So that's Islam does give permission, and even if you look 100 years ago in all our countries, right, corporal punishment was allowed at schools, and even to this day in California and other parts of the country, you are allowed to spank. Right, it's in the law books. You are allowed certain types of discipline is allowed. However, one is the law, one is the spirit of the law. And Rasulullah himself, Anas bin Malik says, he never hit any member of his family. He never hit me at once. He never hit any of his family members. It's never recorded he hit any person except in the situation of war. He never raised his hand on anyone. So the model and example of Rasulullah, although he did give permission through his words, his practical model and practical example, he never hit anyone. And what happens, it is a fine line, because if you use physical discipline too much, you end up breaking that child. You end up creating resentment of that child. You end up the child ends up rebelling even more, and you end up with negative psychological consequences. You end up falling in your face. The whole situation ends up ending up in a negative situation. Mm-hmm. So there is a middle ground, and I said there's a middle ground. Looking at the time and era we're living in, I believe parents should focus on encouragement, and really you should limit corporal punishment and spanking as much as possible. It should only be done in extreme situations. Yet at the same time, I think there's a balance, because we're living in. We also have a generation, especially the children who are around us, and the youth who I interact with on a daily basis. Many of them end up becoming spoiled brats, and they end up becoming really narcissists and spoiled brats because there's no discipline at all. So there is a middle ground. Again, there's a middle ground between no discipline, and there's a middle ground between too much discipline and too much physical beatings and punishments. And the other extreme, we see in many of these children, there's no control at all. The parents have no control at all. The children do whatever they want. And the children completely act out. They never receive discipline at all. My wife, she's a school teacher. She says sometimes these children, there's no discipline at home. There's no discipline at home. Just a little bit of discipline would mean they would behave a lot better. So I would say there is a middle ground, but the overall teaching of Rasulullah was not to hit. Overall, he himself never hit, and there wasn't a need for him to hit either. There wasn't a need for him to spank. Again, what I say, corporal punishment would be a means of creating discipline and getting the child to do what you want. And if you can do it without hitting that child, there's no need for it. Right? That if you can discipline that child, the child will listen to you. You've won over that child, and you've had that bond with the child. Where the child is willing to do whatever you tell them to do, without hitting them, there's no need for it. Right? That's just a summary. Of course, the laws of the country are also there. It means we can't, beyond that, just that spanking. Other types of hitting is not permissible, is not legal. There's also child protective services and so on. So there's a lot of other implications. Overall, I would strongly discourage hitting anything beyond spanking, and I would encourage following the law of the country as well, and not having our children being taken into foster homes or CPS stepping in. Right? It's not an ideal situation at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next question is from Sister Habiba from Illinois, and I guess this is a common struggle that a lot of parents have, that, she's saying that she has a 7-year-old son, and she's having trouble teaching him salah, so he does not want to pray, just simply does not want to pray. So what are some tips that we can use to, teach children of that age to pray, because the hadith mentions that you should encourage them to pray at 7.
Yeah, I would say the main thing is encouragement. I strongly believe if children see certain things within us, they see a commitment to perform salat, for example. And they see us wherever we are as parents, wherever we go, we're offering our salat. Right? And we make it a point, and we encourage them to do so. I think that itself, in the long term, I'll say it's a 2-step process. Number one, ourselves being regular with salat and encouraging our children. Number two, I think it's also really effective to read Fadail Salat, to inform our children of the virtues of salat. I didn't get a chance to cover this in the lecture. Why ta'aleem at home is so important, and why books like Riyadh Salihin, Fadail Amal are so important. So our children get motivated, they learn of the virtues of action. If a child knows the benefits of reading salat, the rewards and virtues of reading salat, that will also motivate them. So I think, yes, in the beginning, even at the age of 7, the child might not read salat. Right? My own children, sometimes it's a challenge getting them to read salat. But I think by encouragement, by always encouraging them, and ourselves being regular with salat, inshallah, a day will come when that child will be regular with salat. And we have to keep planting the seeds. We ourselves have to be regular with it. And inshallah, the children, at some point in time, I firmly believe, if you teach the child in the right way and encourage that child enough, that child on their own, maybe not at the age of 7, maybe not at the age of 10, but our goal is that child, by the time the child becomes baligh, becomes of age, and reaches puberty, when reckoning starts and good deeds are written down, by then we want that child to be regular with salat. And we have from the age of 7 to the age of 12 or 13 or 15 to encourage that child and to develop that good habit. Right? So it's not only, I would say at the age of 7, don't look at it as a overnight change that has to take place. You have time. And keep working on it. Right? Work on one salat a day. Right? It's most of us, it's hard to jump in and start offering five times salat a day every day, especially salat al-fajr. And start with one salat and build on it and work on it gradually. So I would say, as parents, don't expect your children at the age of 7 to offer all the 5 salat. Set it as a goal, work on it, encourage them, and your deadline or your expiry date would be by the time they become baligh. And I would say, rather than use less force and push them less, and try to create the love of salat more. Focus on the rewards, encouragement, benefits of salat. Focus on that more. You don't want them to offer salat just because you're telling them to do it. You want them to get the love of that salat, so that they will have that love of salat, and they will read salat on their own, wherever they are, whether they're at school, whether they're at work. They will have the habit of reading salat for the rest of their lives. That's your long-term goal. And if that's going to take a few years, if that's going to take a few years of encouragement and reading books of hadith, you work toward that goal.
Okay, Jazakumullah khair. Another question, which is a common struggle once again, is that parents have, they try to keep their children away from electronics, from gadgets and stuff. And a sister from Chicago was asking that, when our kids go to public school, and they're surrounded by children who are addicted to electronics rather than activities. So how do we, get our children to stay away from this and not be influenced? And how do we balance this, technology and raising kids?
Yeah. There's an interesting joke online. Right. So I was born in 1978. So I grew in a generation which there was no gadgets, or there was really where there were no cell phones. I grew up in the 80s. So the joke is that I also had a social media when I was growing up. Me and my friends, we had a social media when we were growing up too. It was called Outside. It's called Going Outside. So as a parent, I myself have six children. It is a constant struggle. I truly believe that in order for us to, by default, a child will sit and play computer games and watch YouTube or watch TV all day. Right? That's the way the next generation is. By default, they will they'll sit down, they will take the computer, they'll take whatever it is. By default, that's the direction things are going. And we as parents, we need to create halal alternatives and fun alternatives to the being hooked on electronics. Right? I remember one of my neighbors. There was a neighbor that there's a child, the 14-year-old child that lived next to me for 1 year. Right? He was my next door neighbor. I only saw him like 3 times in the whole year. He would camp out in his room and just play Halo 3 or COD or whatever, Call of Duty, whatever you want to call it. You never saw the kid. I never saw the kid for 1 year. I saw him like 3 times. So what I would say is that we have to create alternatives and have different activities, do different things with our kids, and give them other alternatives. Right? This should be a different seminar topic: how to raise our children without a TV at home, how to raise our children without gadgets at home. Right? Well, the challenge is you have to give them alternatives. Right? And if you're going to tell them, well, you do nothing with them, you come home and you're busy with your own work, and the children come home and they're going to be home for 6 to 10 hours, the complaint all parents get are we're bored. We want to do something, we're bored. And just telling them to go play outside sometimes doesn't work. You as a parent, you have to create those alternatives for them. Right? And I think there's a lot of things what children can do. I try to post this on social media. Teach your children hobbies. Teach your children, especially daughters, how to sew. Sewing is Islamic teaching. Teaching them how to sew. Teaching them how to sew clothes. Giving them different activities. Teaching them how to cook. Teaching them to help out around the house. Giving them chores around the house. Doing different activities with them. Playing different fun games with them. Having educational time at home. There's also a very motivational story I remember. There's a story online. A Muslim mother was interviewed. I believe she was from Malaysia. And every single one of her children, she did a homeschooling. I think we'll look for that link. It's a very motivational story. This mother she homeschooled all her children. All of them became Hafiz of the Quran. All of them became very smart individuals. She taught them. They all ended up going to university. And she had a regimen for them every day. Right? There was a whole schedule for them daily. She would take out time to teach them. The problem is parents need to give time to their children as well. If you expect them not to watch TV and be on gadgets all day, we need to do activities with them. Take them out hiking, take them out swimming, take them out for sports, take them out for a drive, do things with them. If you have the alternative for them, then they're less likely to be involved in gadgets and electronics. And unfortunately, they call it the plug-in drug. All these gadgets and TV, right? When the parents don't have time for the children, just put them in a cartoon, and we'll pacify the children and placate them by giving them these different toys and electronics because we don't want to spend time with them. Because we ourselves as parents are too busy, and so that's what ends up happening. So I think this is a key issue here. I would say the biggest determinant in this time and age, the biggest factor for bringing up a positive child or not, and giving the positive environment and positive teachings is having a TV at home or not. I think that is the biggest factor and biggest influence on our children's Islamic education. Do we have a TV at home or not? Like that itself, that's a make it or break it issue. That's $1 million question in my opinion. And myself, I can say, I don't keep a TV at home. I do have a computer, but I don't have a TV at home. And there's many experiences I can share, many issues, many challenges. I think that is, in terms of Muslim parenting today, that is the single biggest issue facing Muslim parents. The decision to keep a TV at home or not. And of course, related to that, having an iPad at home, having a computer at home, and so on, giving our children their phones. At what age should you give a child a phone? Should you give them a regular phone? Should you give them a smartphone? Should you monitor their activity? Should you put a sensor, or should we put an app on it, and parental controls and so on? That's a topic. That's a completely separate topic. You can spend a whole 2 or 3 hours discussing.
Okay. Another question from the UK. The brother is asking, how do you balance imparting Islamic knowledge and etiquettes and not going too far, so to turn off the kids, from Islam? So how do you balance that? If you try to do too much, they may get turned off. So how do you balance that risk?
I think it ties back to what I mentioned earlier about the word tarbiyah. It's a gradual process. And what I think is, of course, parents subjectively should look at the situation. Imparting that level of knowledge or that much daily or weekly, which a child can handle. This is a successful teacher can do this, a successful parent can do this, looking at the capacity of the child. Right? Unfortunately, the era we're living in, people don't have long attention spans, especially the next generation, the tech generation. They don't have long attention spans. So I think it's giving them enough, right? Giving them a little tidbit, giving them a little bit. And I don't think it's a good idea to give 2 or 3 hours of education at home daily to our children, especially if they don't have the attention span, especially if we were getting bored. As parents, we should be able to observe the activity and monitor our children. Are they ready listening to this? Are they in the right mood? Are they getting bored? Right? It's that balance. And along with that Islamic teaching, you have to have other fun activities as well. Right? That's what I really think as parents. Everything else which I've mentioned, doing fun activities with them. What I like to do is I like to buy these educational toys. Right? I probably spend a good amount of money buying them different activities they can do. Tie-dye shirt kit, making, for example, ceramics and so on. Designing different things at home. For example, different science activities, different science projects, different activities. Right? Making different things. Educational toys where they can learn different things. Sewing different things, sewing kits. So I think these different activities, if we balance that in, and that way the education should be a hands-on education, but it should not be so book-oriented, or it should not be so technical or rigid, where the child is really the child is not taking it well. It's really a matter of striking that balance. I think striking that balance between fun activities, and look at teachers. Look at kindergarten teachers, look at other teachers. They have to do a balance. Right? They can't just give course content all day. They have to now use different attention-seeking or attention-gathering moments. They have to do different things. So it goes back to the guidelines or etiquettes of a successful teacher or parent. That's why I recommend really read this book, employing successful teaching methods and activities and parenting methods and activities.
Okay. I understand that you have another program to go to. Do you have a little more time to take more questions?
No, I do have more time. I'll take the
Okay. Okay, inshallah. Excellent. So another question we have here is, how do the lessons of the past that you discussed, for example, in the webinar, how do they exactly apply to children nowadays? So the question is, do you appreciate that some things may not apply directly, as children have vastly different lives? It's a long question. I'm just summarizing it. Okay. Essentially saying that the children of the past were more responsible and more respectful. And how do you take those examples and how do you fit those in to the children of today?
So, with regards to stories which I mentioned, yes, there are some situation-specific lessons, and there's some general lessons from the stories. Right? So, yes, I agree, situation-specific. There's certain aspects of the stories that I mentioned. Perhaps our 3-year-old child won't be as mature. Perhaps there's a saying, they don't make them like you used to. Yes, some of the ages which I mentioned in the stories, doing things at certain ages, or certain approaches. So the key to a successful teacher or a parent is tailoring things and customizing things. The overall message which I've given is the same, right? That as parents, there's certain fundamental responsibilities we have to carry out. Of course, a successful teacher or parent will customize and tailorize things for their situation and for their circumstances. And so I think the message is the same, right? The message of Islam, the message of the parent is the same. Yes. The next example I gave. For parents to for children to value the dua of their parents. Now, I can tell my children that in a book, I can write it down for him, or I can take him out fishing, and I can make dua that he catches a big fish, and he learns the value of his father's dua for life. Right? So there's certain things which can be taught in an unconventional way, or there's certain things which can be taught in a very customized way. Right? Your child might have certain needs; they need to be taught in a certain way. But overall, I think if you heard my lecture and if you heard the points which I made, those 5 action items are general. How you apply them and the specific methodology you use for a child, that's up to you. But the 5 points which I've made, so it doesn't mean take all my stories and incidents which I mentioned literally and apply them, just cut and paste and apply them to the 21st century. That's not what I'm asking you to do. There's some general lessons and points which will apply for all eras and all time periods. There's some general things which I made. I think those 5 things which I mentioned, making dua for your children, you can make that in any time period. Giving that basic Islamic education, that's general, that's universal. How you give that Islamic education, whether you give that at home, whether you give that outside, whether you give that in the masjid, that you can look at your child's need and apply that. But the 5 action items which are presented, I believe those are general, they'll apply to any time period. Bonding with a child, of course, the specific ways that you're bonding with a child will differ depending on where you live, depending on your socioeconomic status, depending on a number of factors, what country you live in. But those general lessons which I've mentioned and the general action items, I believe they will apply to any time period, to any city, to any country, and they'll apply universally.
So another question from a sister in Sacramento. It's an observation that she's saying it's very difficult to bring in fathers generally to parenting workshops. And so do you have any suggestions on how to convince those fathers? Because obviously their involvement is very important, and a mother needs that, the children need the father and the mother. So how does a woman make that happen?
There's no easy answer for that, but this much I can say is that for the proper tarbiyah and to create a proper Muslim child, right? To bring up a Muslim child in a proper way, the statement, it takes a village. Right? And at the bare minimum, if it takes a village to bring up a child and to bring up a good human being and a meaningful human being, both parents are absolutely necessary. Both parents have to be on the same page. They have to care as much. They have to work together as a team, and they have to be on the same page at all times. Now, what's the easy way to get the father involved? There's no easy answer. The era we're living in, we have to encourage one another. We have to encourage one another with love, with kindness. Speak to the father, encourage that father, mention good stories to that father. It's a challenge. If both parents aren't on the same page, it's a struggle bringing the other parent to the same page. And there's no easy answer either. Right? There's no magic thing which I can tell you, which overnight the father will change. I really think it's a matter of both parents realizing their responsibility, both parents becoming mature, accepting their responsibility, realizing their responsibility, and both parents just being on the same page, encouraging one another. Sometimes both parents won't be on the same page. So you, with love, with kindness, it's a matter of encouraging the other parent. And there's no easy way. It may take months for that parent to come on board. It may take years for that parent to come on board. But we have to still keep trying. Whether you're alone, whether both parents are there, you have to keep trying together. And you have to keep doing your best. And inshallah, make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah, keep trying your best and make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for your help. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help, to guide the other parent, to put that understanding in the other parent's mind and heart.
All right, Jazakumullah khair. The next question is from a sister in Scotland. She's asking any advice on young siblings, and this is something perhaps a lot of parents deal with, Any advice on young siblings hitting each other and calling each other names? So how do you deal with children who are constantly engaged in that?
Well, I think it's a challenge. Any person that has more than one child will know that there's going to be sibling rivalry, there's going to be issues. And I would say there's a question here. You don't necessarily need the Islamic guidelines here either. General parenting will also, there's different methods. Explaining to the child that it's wrong, pointing it out to the child. If the child doesn't listen, using different discipline methods, using timeouts. Right? It's going to be a constant challenge. When you have more than one child, it's going to be a constant challenge. Learn from different parenting methods. It's a question you can take from the secular field. Learn from different parenting methods and parenting books. And I don't think any parent with more than one child will tell you it's not going to completely go away. Children will always somehow or another get into fights, argue. I think it's more of a matter of minimizing it than completely doing away with it. I don't think any parent here or any person listening to this lecture can say their children they have more than one child and children completely are best friends with one another, and they never argue, they never fight, they never scream, or they never hit one another. So I think it's more of a matter of minimizing it and doing your best.
Okay. Another question. Is it permissible, rather maybe we can say, should a father bathe or change the nappy diaper of his daughter?
Yeah, it is permissible. The father can do it, and the father should do it. The father should help out. I didn't get a chance to mention this. The Rasulullah used to help out with the household chores, and father should play a role in the children's lives. And changing the nappies or helping the child take a bath, within the first few years, there's no problem doing it. Yes, at the age of 9, close to the age of 9, that daughter now reaches the age of close to the age of adulthood, and the father should kind of be careful with unnecessary physical contact. But at a young age, assisting in changing the nappies of the child, it's not a problem. And in fact, the father should do it.
Okay. So
as a lighter note, I sometimes I make it a point. As a parent, I make it a point. I said, as a father, I told my children, look, I changed your diapers when you were young. Remember, I changed your diapers when you were young.
MashaAllah. So, next question, Brother Waqas from Ottawa, Canada. He's asking, how do you balance your time between work? I think it's not about you, but just generally between work, personal pursuits, seeking knowledge, and your children, especially if the mother is also busy with Islamic classes. So if both parents are very busy, and so how do they, and their pursuits are all noble, they're all pursuing Islamic education, for example. So how do they balance that out?
Yeah, again, I think there's no right answer. Maybe just logistics and scheduling, and it's doing your best. Having a good routine or schedule can help. Like as the Malaysian mother, which I referred to you, she had an exact schedule timed out from the morning, from the time the children wake up till they go to sleep. There's a nap time schedule in there. There's classes, Islamic classes. There's secular classes. She had a very rigid schedule and very precise schedule. So I think it is a challenge. We live. Parents nowadays are extremely busy. There's different things going on. I would say a few things: setting a good schedule, and number 2, not wasting time. I really think read Sheikh Abdul Fattah's book, The Value of Time. You can get it online. Qimat al-Zaman and al-Ulama, The Value of Time. I think we have a lot of time, but we waste a lot of time. As parents, there's more than enough time in 24 hours. There's more than enough time in a day for us to do everything. Right? But it's a matter of being disciplined. It's a matter of not wasting time. You can do your work. You can do your Islamic classes. People have done wonders if by managing your time and valuing your time and making the most of your time, people have done wonders. Right? You'll find Mufti Abdullah Nana, for example. He's written entire books just from the time from Asr and Maghrib every day. He will sit down from the time, maybe 1 hour a day between Asr and Maghrib, and he's written 5-volume books over 10 years. Right? So we have that time. And a lot of that time is wasted on TV. A lot of the time is wasted on useless things, or wasted on YouTube, or wasted on Facebook, or wasted on social media. As parents, minimize your time on social media, on TV, and useless things, and you'll find more than enough time. Right? So with His will is a way, good scheduling, good time management, good just logistics. I think if we as parents just do our best, there should be more than enough time for us to learn about Islam, for us to teach our children, for us to do our own. Right? Look at Rasulullah as an example as well. Right? In the Shama'il Tirmidhi, it's pretty amazing how Rasulullah used to divide up his time. Right? Think about this 1400 years ago. In the Shama'il Tirmidhi, there's exact Rasulullah used to divide his time up in 3 ways. One for himself, one for his family, and one for the masses. And then the time for the family would divide up in this way. You'll see exact guidelines for how the person to spend his time. So yes, sometimes it's challenging, but I think if we just put our minds to it and manage our time wisely, everything can be done, inshallah.
Okay, Jazakumullah khair. The next question is probably a question that you've gotten quite a few times in the past. So in terms of sending our children to public schools versus Islamic schools, so if we have the option for both, and keeping in mind that Islamic schools are expensive and lack in academics, so what should we do in that situation?
Yeah.
And this is referring to the Western context. Sorry.
I would say a lot of these questions, if even our listeners don't mind, there's other people a lot more qualified than me, and these are. It's very difficult to cover these questions in 1 or 2 minutes. I really think you could. It's an important question. It's a very detailed question as well. Depending on where you live, depending on the end objectives, depending on the maktab system, meaning the after-school classes available, depending on the access to a scholar, depending on who teaches at an Islamic school, depending on the level of Islam found in the Islamic school. I'm sorry to put it this way, depending on the level of Islam found in the Islamic school. Because many Islamic schools, unfortunately, Islam is there by name. So there's a number of factors at play, depending on whether or not we can do home education for our children, depending on what scholars or what classes or Islamic classes are available for our children, depending on the existence of a maktab or an after-school class program for our children. So there's a number of factors at play. There isn't one size fits. There is no one size fits all answer here. There's a number of factors. I know a number of my teachers and a number of friends who send their kids to public schools, but I also know a number of people who send their children to Islamic schools. Now, what's as you said, the tuition? What's the tuition in the Islamic school? It's my opinion that Islamic schools, every Islamic school should have an Islamic scholar or a specialist in Islam who's teaching Islamic classes. That's not the case in many Islamic schools, right? Any auntie or uncle or anyone off the street, they'll bring them in to teach the Islamic classes. Right? In other countries I've seen, every single Islamic school there's a scholar teaching this class. So there's a number of factors at play even at Islamic schools. There's a number of factors at play. To what extent do they have the Islamic ethos or Islamic values at that school? So there's a number of factors at play. I also personally feel, this may be politically incorrect, Islamic schools should be segregated. Right? If you have an Islamic high school and the boys and girls are going to school together, unfortunately, you're going to see some of the same issues in that Islamic high school which you're going to see in a normal high school. Okay? And segregated education, looking at Islamic teachings, that's also a factor as well. So there's a number of factors to look at. I would say that you could spend a great deal of time elaborating on this issue and discussing this issue in more depth. I've done my best to highlight some of my concerns, but really I can't do justice to the question in a few minutes. I think you can write blogs, you can write articles, you can have entire lectures just on this one question.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. So then another question is that a lot of children suffer from identity crisis in the West due to different environments. for example, at home, and versus pressures to be like the other kids at public schools. So how can a parent help a child who is going through this issue?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think part of it is if you've seen a certain situation and you understand the situation, you're better equipped to deal with it. And maybe there's a difference between first-generation parents versus immigrant parents and understanding what exactly children go through in the school system, what exactly they go through with the public culture, sometimes having to hide their Islam, sometimes people making fun of them because they're Muslims. I think first of all, it's parents understanding what the children are going through. If you don't understand, if you can't diagnose the situation and understand what the children are going through, you won't be able to react accordingly or deal with the situation accordingly. Right? So whether parents have to understand the challenges that children face at schools, some of their issues. If you yourself can't really understand or relate to it, talk to the imam, talk to other people, and really understand. First of all, try to understand what the child is going through, and they're being pointed in different directions. Right? Many of the Muslim children, they say they have two identities. One is at home, one is with their friends. So number one is just understanding what the children are going through and coming up with a game plan of action. Many of these questions, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. It's a challenge. Being able to relate to that child, being able to instill that, being able to instill in that child who he is, or who she is, helping them understand that. There's going to be no size-fits-all answer, but I think it does help that we as parents, we continue with our responsibilities, doing our best to impart those values in education at all times. Really, I believe if preemptive measures, if we do our best right from the beginning, and we keep tarbiyah from the beginning to the end, right, gradually giving that Islamic value and Islamic education, and imparting the Islamic teachings from the time they're born to the time they grow up. Yes, there are going to be hurdles on the way, but we have to still keep doing our job. And even when the children were going to go through the teenage years, when they're going to rebel, you still have to be there for them. You still have to be able to bond with them. You still have to be able to, they should be able to come to you for your question. You should be able to communicate with them openly. And that's part of it. And having that conversation, sitting down with your child. We learn from the story of Ibrahim al-Islam, Ismail al-Islam, being able to talk openly with your child. Oh, my son, oh, my daughter, I see you're going through this challenge. I see you're kind of, you're ashamed of being a Muslim. You're ashamed of wearing hijab, and so on. How do we approach this? How do we deal with it? Yeah, so I think that's part of it. That there's no easy solution. Right? When you're going through identity crisis, there's no easy solution. It will take a great deal of work and parenting to help that child get over it. Sometimes the child will have to learn by for themselves. But just us being there for support for them, for us trying to help them out and encouraging them, I think that's the best approach. Sometimes they have to learn for themselves. Right? Sometimes they have to learn the hard way. Sometimes.
Okay. Jazakumullah khair. One straightforward question: would you encourage university for girls?
Yeah, I think that's also a case by case. Yeah, that's
okay.
I will say that the number of muftis and scholars have written about university education, and one is giving a fatwa on university education, and one is going to university yourself and understanding what happens there. It's an eye opener. Recently, there's a study out there about Muslims engaging in risky behaviors at universities. And I'm sure you can see it on social media. I can retweet it if you wish. What percentage of Muslims are drinking alcohol in universities? What percentage of Muslims are engaged in premarital sex? What percentage of Muslims are engaged in alcohol, in drugs, and other behavior? It's eye opening. It's eye opening. May Allah protect us all. It's pretty scary. So it's something to consider. Again, I think just that one question: should our Muslim youth be going to universities? And more importantly, are they ready to go to that university? Right? On a case-by-case basis, is that child strong enough to weather the storm that will face him at the university? that storm of atheism, of materialism, of temptation and evil, is that child enough to strong enough to weather that storm? I myself, I graduated from UC Berkeley. I went to school. There's a lot of challenges on the way. There's a lot of temptations on the way. Is our child ready for that? Will we lose our child in that process? And something for parents to consider. Is that secular degree, or is that dream job, our child getting that dream job, is it worth that trade-off that our child loses their Islam, loses their identity, and picks up negative habits, and we lose themselves in the process? Is it worth that? Is it worth that trade-off? Is a secular degree, becoming a doctor, living happily ever after, getting that degree, is it worth that cost? Is it worth that loss? And again, there's no easy answer. I think that you could spend some time discussing this topic. At the very least, I think we can agree that there are challenges and there are costs involved. Right? That many of our Muslim children that are coming out of universities, there is a significant cost, and it comes at a price. It comes at a price. And especially if almost 50% of Muslim youth and college students are doing these activities, as parents, can we sit by and watch them and allow this to happen? It's something to consider. I'm not saying there's a right answer, there's a wrong answer. It's something we should consider. And what university we're sending them to, of course, there's a number of factors at play. Are they going to live in a dorm? Are they going to commute? Which school is it? Is it a Catholic school? Is it a segregated school? Even in America and UK, to this day, you have some women's only schools. So what type of school is it? Is it a party school? And so on. As a parent, you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. At what level of deen is our child? Is he reading his 5 times Salah already? Do they love Islam for themselves? Do they have that desire to practice when you're not around? Are they strong enough to weather that storm? These are all questions to ask.
Okay, excellent. So one last final question.
Sure.
Any advice on kids reading? So this is about access to, what kind of information you want to give your children and what kind of access you want them to have. So any advice on kids reading fiction books as opposed to non-fiction?
There's an interesting article out there about some of the themes and messages in Harry Potter. Right? I believe it was written by a Muslim lady. Also, so number one is that as parents we should realize there are a lot of dangers and evil influences in the modern world and even in books. There's also an excellent article online by a Muslim teacher about 50 Shades of Grey, the famous book that was published. All these young girls are reading it, and all these Muslim youth are reading it. Same thing about Harry Potter. So if you read through the books, there's a lot of messages. There's a great deal of evil influence about magic, about relationships, about intimacy, and so on. So I think as parents, we should play an active role in our children's education. Pay attention to the books they're reading. Pay attention to what they're studying, and do your best to give positive influences. I personally feel as parents, put positive options out there. Take them, look for good books. There's plenty of literature in the English language for youth. There's plenty of books out there. Look for good influences and encourage them. And at the very least, if they are reading, for example, if they're reading non-Islamic books, then minimize the damage, do damage control. Try to pick books which have positive messages. Right? You walk in the bookstore, there's certain books which are just motivational books. Okay, there might be a book which it's not necessarily an Islamic book, but it's a book about working hard. Maybe it's a book about so-and-so basketball player. They worked hard. They ended up making it to the NBA. They ended up helping their family, and they lived happily ever after. And there's positive themes, there's positive messages, adversity, and so on. So there's a number of books where they're positive messages, and there's a number of books where there's really negative messages, where the person really talks about their drug addiction, talks about other things. So there's a number of books with negative influences as well. I think we as parents, we should play an active role. We should, for example, nonfiction books. There's many nonfiction books and biographies which have positive messages, and there's a number of non-fiction books which have really negative influences. And so I think it's a matter of playing an active role. And as parents, we should play an active role in a lot of things. The internet content of our children, what they read, the books they have, even the school books they read. And I remember in my college days, there were books I was reading about really negative issues, really things that really disturbed me. And these are books in the reading list. These are books in the college class reading list. And in the same way, a lot of the books, there's books with positive messages in the school reading list, but there are many books with negative influences as well.
Okay, Jazakumullah khair. Mufti Abdullah, thank you very much for giving us your time. There certainly, I'm sure there were some questions that were overlooked. I apologize about that. It's very hard to kind of go through this whole thing. So you can just get in touch with us. Inshallah, we'll forward these questions to Mufti Abdullah and he can get back to you. I'll need to end this here because we're getting pretty close to Maghrib here. Inshallah, I request everyone to keep us in your du'as and definitely go to RayyanInstitute.com, check it out, check out the courses, and maybe perhaps even enroll in them, and perhaps get your children interested in them as well. So before we end, I'll just ask Mufti Abdullah to make a short dua, inshallah, and then we'll conclude.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Wa salatu wassalamu ala Muhammadin kareem. La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu minadh dhalimin. ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا لنكن من الخاسرين. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. رب اجعلني مقيم الصلاة ومن ذريتي ربنا وتقبل دعاء. ربنا اغفر لي ولوالدي وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب. رب اوزعني أن أشكر نعمتك التي أنعمت علي وعلى والدي ونعمل صالحا ترضاه واصلح لي في ذريتي. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, grant us children who will be the source of the coolest of our eyes. Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reform our children, make them pious. Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, make our children who will perform the salat and establish their salat on a regular basis. Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, protect our children from all the evils and the trials and tribulations and the corrupted environment which is around us. Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ensure that our children live as Muslims and die as Muslims. Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, protect this next generation and guide them, and give us as parents, give us the ability to bring them up in the right way. And oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, give us the ability as parents to realize our responsibility and carry out our responsibility in the best of ways. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.